time is something too ambitious, that I feel uh, I do see that there things are changing, things are emerging in the AI sector, but legislation is something is too ambitious to dream at this point of time. To have a regulation at this point of time, I think the AI has still not developed to that an extent in India. I have certain amount of things to offer, right, perspectives to offer right now, that how AI, and because the topic for discussion is to look at things from a feminist perspective, and more than a feminist perspective, also to keep in view that we are discussing something about India, something about the developing economies. So yes, AI is something is still at a quite a developing stage in India, far behind than most of the developed countries of the world. But if you look at the women in the developing countries, let's talk about AI from the feminist perspective, what the topic is for today. And from the developing country perspective, and more specifically India, you would see that the women in the developing countries, and particularly in the South Asia, they are perceived as, more of them are doing as domestic works, and they are underrepresented in many high level professions, like you mentioned, in law and technology. And that is why they are disproportionately underemployed, and they face prejudice in the workplace also. Now let me, because there's limited time slot that's been given to us, but let me bring out one or two points which will be focused towards this today's discussion. One point that I want to bring out is that India have experienced instances, when technology has been utilized to say create gender bias. Let's try and understand that, there has been a great misuse of some of the techniques like sonography or ultrasound is some of them, that the public as such, you've seen that they have misappropriated sonography, which was intended to, determine the unborn's health aspects, right? Rather than, looking for the determining the gender of the fetus. And how is this uh, visible is from the point of view, you can say that the declining sex ratio. So in 1981, where we had around say 962 females per 1000 males, as of 2011 census, this has declined to 918 females. So despite the government passing the preconception and prenatal diagnostic techniques act to halt this trend, this has not been helpful because implementation has been a problem. Now in the realm of AI, if we look at, gender balance is something very critical issue, and it becomes pertinent also in a country like India, where there is already a lot of discrimination amongst women and men. So the idea is that as lawyers, as policymakers or as thinkers, we should be in a position where we are not exacerbating this difference. We should be in a position where we are trying to bridge the gap, not widening the gap. Why are we discussing this topic today? Because we know that AI has the potential to even widen this gap. Why? Because what is AI? AI is some set of algorithms which we humans develop. How are we humans affected? And particularly if you're talking about developing country like India, because it's humans like us who are designing the algorithms, and we are affected by biases, by bias. So if we have a bias, the algorithm is bound to show that bias because it's created by humans like us. Sometimes the algorithm developers may not be aware of the prejudices and, the implicit bias, and the implicit bias that exists. So unknowingly they pass their socially, rooted gender prejudices on the robots. So this is something which you will see evident also in the present trends in machine learning, that reinforces historical stereotypes of women, say such as humility, mildness, or say the need for protection. So for instance, you would see that if you see security robots, they are primarily male, but if you look at service robots, they are primarily female. So, and another example, if I could give you, of the AI driven risk analysis in the justice system, is that the algorithm can actually overlook the fact that that women are less likely to reoffend other than reoffend than men, and this would actually place women at some sort of a disadvantage. So this female gendering, more particularly in the developing countries, what is it does essentially is that it increases the bots, I would say, increases the bots perceived humanity and the acceptability of AI. So consumers believe that the AI is the female AI is more humane and it is more reliable. Therefore, they are more ready to meet users' particular demands. But there have been, I would say, that the biases still exist when you are designing algorithms and it is designed by people who are, say, settling or settled in a particular jurisdiction or cultural setup, uh, that affect their decision making. And like you also mentioned in the beginning of the while opening remarks, that because of the gap that exists in law and technology between men and women working in this area, that is something is also a challenging position to look at. If we are looking for a responsible AI, the idea is to build some sort of a responsible AI, to have a responsible AI from a feminist perspective in a developing economy. We need to understand that this gap needs to be bridged. We need to understand that this bias needs to be improved and eliminated eventually. And because women make such a small percentage of the workforce, technology may become some sort of a tangible incarnation of the male power in the coming years. So we have to, as some people like us who are in this domain at this moment, our duty is to look forward to reduce this gap. And the situation, to conclude, I would say, is that in the developing world is more worse, and hence some sort of a cautious approach is required to ensure that the male dominated society in some of the developing world countries do not abuse the AI power and rather use it to exacerbate the predicament of the women who are already in somewhat precarious position in um, developing countries like India. Yeah.
Okay. That was very helpful, Nidhi. I think you've taken care of a lot of important facets. Of course, especially these challenges definitely are more serious in the developing countries, and India being one of them. There is already a lot of biases and inequalities existing in the physical space. And while we need to take cognizant steps towards that, it's important to understand how we can stop them from being spilling into the tech space as well. Very quickly, I would now like to move to Asna for her inputs. So, Asna, I think Nidhi covered a lot of aspects from the societal perspective, how society needs to tackle, and the question also focused on the government coming up with policies and what has happened therein. But I definitely all agree that as much as this is a societal thing, as much as this is a government thing, the companies, the private sector also has an equal role in ensuring a truly wholesome, responsible development of AI. So, in terms of India, I would just like to understand, do you think there is a conscious effort by Indian companies to ensure that the AI that they are developing protects the interests of women and other marginalized communities? Do you think there is any impediment that currently the Indian companies are facing to this end, or some way in which the government can incentivize such an approach in a more uh, effective manner, so to say? Over to you.
Shruti, thank you for that question. Shruti, I feel that right now it is like Nidhi said, it's these are very early days for AI, and regulation is a very tightrope for government and the industry alike to walk, because it's a growing field, and we still don't know where where eventually this will stabilize, what the stable state is. Having said that, there is a thrust from the government on responsible AI principles. The Niti Aayog report is one such example of that. And we can't hide from the fact that there is a great disparity. There are roughly 28% women in AI in India. Um, Having said that, I think that things are looking up also because relative to the world, India is doing fairly well. In Stanford's Global AI Vibrancy Index, India aced the inclusion parameter. While there's a lot of ground to cover, this is by no means saying that we can't rest on our laurels, and we have a lot of ground to cover. But I think in terms of education, we are seeing more and more girls come into STEM and then consequently into AI. And as far as the industry goes, I feel uh, since there is no stick as such, the carrot for companies is the way they are perceived, and trust, like I say, is a very important currency, that the intangible currency that we deal in. It's something that can't be overlooked, and therefore is an important factor for as a motivation for companies.
Okay. Thanks, Asna. Thank you so much for that input. I would now like to move to Ayushi for her views on some of the topics. And given that she's been working with one of the leading organizations in India on AI, and she herself is a designer working on emerging tech and AI specifically, I would just like to understand from you, Ayushi, that what are some of the major biases that you would have encountered that AI's or AI technology in general has against marginalized communities? Just basis your experience over the years, and given your deep experience in designing of human-centered technology and human-centered design, how can we ensure this that the AI development is more equitable and inclusive right from the designing stage?
Yeah, thanks for that, Shruti. And I think I was really excited to have this conversation today because I think it's something that internally in our organization we're talking about all the time, really. Because, like, for example, if you see some of the projects that we're working on, whether it be, trying to assess newborns' weight using a video, so that rural communities or ashas can actually give healthcare access to these rural communities. Or you're talking about being able to predict TB patients who will stop adhering to treatment protocols. In all of these spaces, are such important spaces, and they have. I mean, we truly hold ourselves accountable to the fact that if there's some bias that creeps in, it's really going to harm the community. And I think when we're creating these models and we're sitting in our teams, there is a very frequent conversation that we have around what is our data set looking like? What are the fairness metrics that we're really striving to achieve? Of course, there is accuracy that everyone's trying to achieve with their models, but along with that, what are the fairness metrics that we're trying to look at? And I think a typical, if you just kind of adopt a data set, that's just handed over to you. Sometimes because of tech access in rural communities, sometimes it's just because of some services are more used by a certain part of the community and some services are not used by a certain part of the community. So the data set automatically has those biases. And some of the more obvious ones, of course, gender being a huge topic in India, but I would extend that conversation a little bit further to say that it is different classes of society. It's different castes, it's different languages that people speak in, different places that they come from. And I think each data set, depending on where it's coming from, has its own unique characteristics. And I think if I have to kind of take that a step further and say, why are we even having this conversation today? I think if you trace back to like a few years ago, I don't think in such an open forum we would be having a conversation on biases, right? Let alone feminist sort of conversation. And one of the things I believe we're having this conversation is because of the new open AI tools that have come in to the market, and people in the community are being able to kind of participate in this conversation. They don't need to really be part of the tech ecosystem. They can really just be anyone. And I mean, I don't know how many of you all have used Lensar AI, but it's one example that I came across. And there's Ali K. Miller, who's a strong woman leader in the space of AI who I've been following for a while. And she spoke about a really interesting topic about her experience using Lensar AI, right? Where she used this product, and all it does is you upload images of yourself and it converts them into avatars. Fairly simple. It's not really hard hitting a problem as the problems we try to work with within our organization. But I'm using a simple example here just to help people understand what biases can do. So she uploaded selfies of herself, and it converted them into avatars, and the images that she extracted out of them were fairly nice. They were beautiful, but what they really did was the kind of clothes that those avatars are wearing, the kind of hand gestures that they were doing weren't very I would say from a woman's perspective. It was much more from a man's perspective of what he sees a beautiful woman as. And on digging deeper, you kind of notice that a lot of the team members, I mean, I kind of just went in to see who are the creators of this AI, and a lot of the functional heads were men. So it's quite possible that their implicit bias sort of kind of creeped into what they thought were beautiful women, right? And that's similar to what can possibly happen when you're working on more hard hitting problems that have more far reaching impact. If you don't have sort of like a nice mixed group of people who are working on the problem to begin with. um, and coming to the perspective of design, right? I mean, I truly believe after working in this space for a few years now that there are really three things I think are important in really trying to strive for responsible AI. One is, of course, the data set. The second is what you define success as, and the third is how do you deploy it. Um, and I think the string that ties all of these three things together is really understanding the community you're designing for, understanding the users you're designing for, so that you can make sure that the model that you're creating, the AI that you're creating, is rooted in human need. Of course, this could be a bias from the function that I come from, but I really do believe that it's helped us move further along in our journey of creating responsible models. And I kind of just say a sentence each about, like, these three steps and what does that mean for designers like me who kind of just probably coming into this conversation of AI, because it's still fairly nascent, like some of the other panelists also spoke about. I think when you're creating a representative data set, if you do take the time to understand societal issues that are already present, do take the time to understand the biases that might be present in the data set, you can do something to kind of either offset the impact of that bias, or maybe create more data to be able to kind of train the models uh, more fairly in some sense. Then if you're thinking about success metrics, in addition, like I spoke about fairness metrics, if you hold yourself and your team responsible for saying that, hey, while we're trying to achieve accuracy, we also want to talk about the fairness metrics. And where will the fairness metrics emerge from? It emerge from an initial understanding of who the users are, what the societal problems are, and then what are the fairness metrics that you are striving to achieve. Sometimes I've seen in my experience and in my conversations with ML researchers that a very good model that gives great accuracy might not fare as well on the fairness metrics, might not be as explainable. And there's always this sort of tug of war that you're trying to say that, hey, do I want to achieve the best model, or do I want to kind of maybe take a step back and achieve a okay model, which is probably fairer? So that's a conversation we as creators in this space kind of need to be open to having. Uh, and I think the last thing when you're thinking about deployment, it's really thinking about, okay, you have something that you've created, but what happened if it was misused? If it was used in a way to marginalize someone, discriminate against someone, even if you create a really fair model, it could still be perceived differently by different parts of the community. So I mean, an exercise, and design is all about co-creation, right? We try to involve everyone within the team. So one of the exercises that we do with our team at the very beginning of the project is to bring in all different functions of the team together in the room. This means that you have a slightly more gender neutral sort of group that's looking at it. This also means that you have people from different castes and different places of society that they're coming from, talking about, hey, if this model succeeded, then what benefit would it give? And that's the easier part of the conversation, because everyone's very excited to talk about benefits. But if this model sort of didn't succeed, if it was if it didn't have great performance, or if it was unknowingly unfair, even though you strive for fairness metrics, you have to always be open to the fact that the model's constantly learning, and there could be biases that that start creeping in. Even those weren't that there, even those that weren't there in the beginning, they could start creeping in, right? What happens then, and what is the human impact on that? And sharing those human impact sort of conversations really helps us as a team feel more strongly and more empathetic to the responsibility that we hold while creating. Yeah, so I think that's sort of my 2 cents on how I perceive this space.
Thanks a lot, Ayushi. I think that was quite extensive and very, very informative. You've covered some of the very important elements around not just designing, but even the deployment, and how it's important that even after deployment, inclusive development and ensuring that the AI keeps learning and improving is important. So, thanks a lot for that intervention. Now, I would like to move to Laura. Laura has an extensive experience working with the OECD, and now she is working with one of the leading technology companies of the world. So, Laura, I would just like to understand your perspective under both your roles, like given your work at OECD. I'm sure that you can share some of your views about what are the key policy interventions that countries across the world are taking, or that they need to take to encourage such inclusive AI development from a feminist perspective. More importantly, under your current role working at Meta as one of the leading AI policy managers, it will also be important to understand what is the role of companies like Meta and other the key players in the technology space to ensure that other companies also adopt inclusive approach, something that Meta is doing. What is your company's outlook towards this? So would love to get your views on these aspects.
Thank you so much, Shruti, and also for the opportunity to put some hats at the same time. Thank you for all the very, very interesting and fascinating thoughts from this panel, from Nidhi, from Asna and Ayushi. I think it really resonates on what's the state of the art in terms of what is needed and what also different actors are doing. Perhaps to answer your first question on what governments are doing, I think there are multiple fronts from which governments have started to implement their national AI strategies, and not only in terms of embedding all these principles in a set of responsible AI principles, and now potentially some more hard law approaches, but also when it comes to policies that enable innovation in a way that we can trust, in a way that it can foster our economies. So we see, for example, building digital infrastructure, providing access to data sets, ideally data sets that, of course, mitigate as much as possible all these risks associated to fairness, to privacy, and allow for the respect of human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. Is a hard endeavor. It's a hard endeavor to also bring different sort of data sets in this regard. But I see there are positive efforts around the world to make this happen. And now this is a core priority and is the forefront of the agenda to make sure that whatever is put out there really is as mitigated as much as possible. There's, of course, lots of work to do there, but now there's more awareness, and when there's awareness, I think that there's a way forward. So there are reasons to remain positive. On the point of Asna, and I want to recapitulate that again. I think there are reasons to be positive when it comes to AI skills and education. India is one of the leading countries, as you mentioned, like almost 30% of the publications are made by women or involved as authors or co-authors. This is something that almost doubles the percentages compared to Europe or the US. And that is something to be proud of and excited and show the world that it is possible and there's a way forward in that regard. When it comes to enable policies for international cooperation as well, I think this is in the agenda of many international organizations, OECD, UNESCO, regional banks, the Inter-American Development Bank, and other institutions. So now that is in the agenda, and I actually some colleagues They're women and they're leading this work in multiple institutions. When we look at these institutions that are led by women, that's also reasons to be hopeful that it's not just one item there in the agenda, but it's really the agenda. So those are things to look out for. When it comes to the role of the private sector, for example, without doubt, there is a lot of responsibility and a lot of reasons to be also positive and aware that this is becoming a priority for companies. Companies wouldn't like to produce any solution or any product that their consumers or end users cannot trust. So this is becoming really paramount when at the design stage with diverse teams, at the development stage with making sure that inclusion, diversity, respect for human rights, risk management frameworks are in place, and so on. Also, before deployment, the role of a stakeholder engagement. And here I want to just briefly talk a little bit more. This was also mentioned by Yushi on the role of understanding the users. And you can only understand the users if you conduct a series of activities that in some cases are called stakeholder engagement. It's not rocket science. But in the case of AI, it's becoming particularly interesting because you have to conduct that stakeholder engagement in a way that allocates for local context and voices, and make sure that the impact that your AI solution is going to have, what's going to be that impact at the direct level and indirect level. So even beyond the end user and well before you deploy the system. So we talk about supply chains, workers, everyone that is involved in the design, development, and deployment of AI systems. Again, here, this is becoming increasingly a priority also for policymakers into how to look at stakeholder engagement as part of risk management frameworks. Indeed, the Council of Europe puts stakeholder engagement as at the heart of its HUD area framework, the human rights for the respect of rule of law and democracy framework impact assessment. And I think there are very interesting things that the private sector is starting to do, leveraging other risk management frameworks and asking themselves about from whom we are designing these. The actors are actually involved in the design, development, and deployment. By whom? Who is doing these systems? The users of the AI system, for whom are we designing? And the stakeholders affected by the AI system, including vulnerable groups, to whom? So all these questions with a focus and then through lenses and using the right instruments, vocabulary, and awareness of what this really entails. I'm excited to share that, and we have started this year, and we have evolved, and I will welcome your participation as well. The first open loop program that we're deploying in India. We had Asna, and we welcome Asna at our roundtable in New Delhi in October. We're continuing with 15 companies, 15 startups that perhaps these broad discussions that are not at the forefront when are doing their work and their AI solutions, but now it's becoming of much interest to them, and they're really invested in thinking about these well before regulations come or more guidance come. That they're really trying to do this from the beginning, and that is really reasons to be hopeful that this is also a priority for startups, not only large companies or companies that have been in the field for a longer period, but really startups that are just starting their journey. So that's something to look out for. In a nutshell, what Open Loop does is a global initiative that is supported by Meta that aims to bring and bridge the gap between emerging tech, including AI, but also regulatory and new experimental approaches to governing these technologies. So through a consortium of stakeholders, the idea is to understand and scope down the issues that are at stake, analyze them, being as inclusive as possible by building a consortium of stakeholders, test and experiment by testing a framework on how to operationalize principles, in this context, the human-centered AI principle, one that really brings many other principles in connection, and to learn what works, what doesn't work, what could be done better, and through that learning and feedback, how can we help to keep informing policies as they're being shaped by other actors. And the ultimate goal of all this is to build trust for those questions: to whom, by whom, for whom. And at the end of the day, we really can say that we're delivering and deploying trustworthy AI. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Laura, for that. And in fact, thank you to all of you for those really heartening remarks. This was very insightful. I think we have 14 minutes remaining for the session. So 10 minutes we can give to question and answers. So would really request all of you to put in your questions either in the chat box, or you can also raise your hand. I think the team would then unmute you and you can share your questions, or otherwise you can drop it in the chat box. I see there are 2 questions already here. So I would begin with the first question. This is from Mr. Satish Babu. The question is, the data used for training, which is drawn from the current economy, society, has built-in biases. Algorithms tend to amplify these biases. How do we de-bias the training data? How do we prevent amplification? And he hasn't mentioned any particular person. So feel free, anybody who wants to take it up. Asna, would you like to?
Glad to. Well, when Ayushi was mentioning the application Lensar showing results which look like they were designed from a male perspective, it brought to mind another example of generative AI. Again, this is falls under the broadish umbrella of generative AI. That there was an experiment where somebody put in the word CEO, and out of so many iterations of trying that, they found out of 12 only 2 non-Caucasian and 0 women. And the nurse, they had majority of the results that ended up showing were of female. Similarly, for data scientists, they saw only 1 woman out of the 14, 15 iterations. So the bias, they exist obviously because of the data that the AI is consuming. And the only way for us to de-bias, apart from regulatory mechanisms, is to add in more data which can offset the possible damage that can be done by data that you cannot control, that just is, and you value that data for some other reasons, for some other feature training. But to be able to offset against the harmful effects of such data, you have to ensure that there's enough data coming in, which is non-biased for the features that you're very careful about, very mindful of.
I'd like to just add one point out there. I think one of the things that we've seen internally that we do is that sometimes if gender is really not that important for what you're doing, or if a particular piece of metadata is not that important, you kind of just remove that from your data set. So that's another way to kind of reduce bias. And I mean, I'm not the ML expert here, but then there are many things that you can do. I don't think we have to live with the biases that data sets have. There's a lot of different techniques to sort of offset the biases that come in. And I think it's more of being aware that they exist and then kind of doing something about it. Yeah.
Right, I like totally agree with these points. Accepting that there's a bias and then tackling it is the most important fact. Only then we can start the de-biasing process. Next, okay, I think we have another question. How can we tackle value pluralism, variation in values across different population groups during developing AI solutions in a diverse country like India? This is from Garima. Anybody who wants to answer this, please go ahead. Yeah, Laura, please.
Yeah, I can jump in.
Sure.
One of the we thought about these when co-designing the prototype that we're going to test with companies, and of course, when it comes to human-centered AI, it means so many things for so many different people. and we are in a world with many different value systems. How can we remain, truthful to broader set of universal principles, while at the same time allocating for local context and voices and the nuances across different communities. And again, I think part of having sort of these flexible frameworks that can accommodate intentionally for the differences across different understandings and value systems is important. It's important to realize that one size does not fit all, and making that, let's say, that very intentional when designing systems and when accommodating for vulnerable, let's say, vulnerable communities, different communities, etc. Is one of the roles and outcomes of conducting proper stakeholder engagement. So to make sure that everyone is included and no one is left behind.
Right, right. Thank you so much for that. I think there is one specific question for you. Just let me, yeah. So maybe you can address that, and then I'll move to Nidhi, because there is a question for Nidhi specifically. So Laura, Kriti is asking that I would like to ask Laura, the state of women participation in stakeholder engagement. So how can women's participation in stakeholder engagement be enhanced? Any input?
I think that there might be many multiple ways, but the most important thing is to be intentional about it when designing and when conducting a stakeholder mapping. Make sure to properly ask the question and leave the space. How many women are we including? Which and be part of that question there. Second, when conducting a stakeholder engagement, make sure that you design engagements that properly allow for the participation of women, where sometimes maybe a focus group might not be useful because it has been proven that women, when they're surrounded by men, they tend to participate less. So taking into consideration all those designs can help to inform a truthful and meaningful stakeholder engagement. It's not just inviting women, but it's actually taking and encouraging them to participate actively and meaningfully in these processes.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Nidhi. Very quickly, I think this is the last question that we have. From a regulatory perspective, where do you think India stands with respect to other jurisdictions in its AI policies to ensure sustainable regulation of AI that promotes human rights? So you're also working at Stanford, so I'm sure that you would be interacting with different experts. And yeah, please go ahead, share. We look forward to your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shruti. I was just looking at the question, I was thinking about it, and uh, see, to be very honest, this is something. This is also a thesis. My thesis is something similar to your what I'm working on, and I'm trying to do more of an empirical work on this topic. And Laura must be knowing because she has been a JSM, so she's a fellow classmate, I would say. So so the idea is that to understand how these algorithm developers using it on the online platform markets, or the violations that take place with respect to the algorithms which operate in any area, be it health sector, any area, to understand that at what point the violation took place. Say if you are a consumer and I am a producer, or the owner of an online platform website, and you come to my website, and you try to look for products, and somehow I try to make the algorithm work in a manner that you're only able to see those products which I think that is beneficial to me. So and then understanding at what point actually things happened which even the algorithm did not intend. So there are various issues with respect to algorithms. Now coming to the question which Garima has asked about that what is the um, law with respect to this area, and how far is the human rights aspect being covered. So when I see human rights, I also see consumer rights, and within the ambit of the human rights. So this is something which is I would not say it at all developed in India. I mean, what we have in India at this moment is is we do not have a law as such. We have some documents, we have some ministries' intentions, some task force, some recommendations of, say, AI explicit computer framework, or some sort of report by Niti Aayog on the responsible AI for all. We have certain principles that, these are the principles that we should follow for an ethical AI, but not a law as such. But Europe, yes, something that I have not worked, but something that I taught at this semester, so I know, is that Europe has the Digital Markets Act, which does look at some of the AI aspects and how can consumer rights be protected, looking into that angle. United States has, again, the various states have their own law, and then there is a federal law. So I'm not going into the specificities, but the US has its own AI strategy on AI, established by the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Act of 2020. So this is something we still do not have in India. So unless there is a law, there is not a law. I really can't comment that, about that, how can we have more sustainable regulation of AI. First, we need to have a law. We do not have a law in India with respect. We do not even have a policy of regulation, I would say. So this is something we still need to work on. Whereas other countries like Europe and US, something that I've worked from the competition law perspective, antitrust perspective, I know that there are laws which are being developed, and Germany being the crusader, the first one to come up even before the EU Digital Markets Act came in. So, this is my answer to Garima's question.
Okay. Thank you so much for all these your patience and for answering all the questions that have been put in here. And I think just 2 minutes are left. So once again, thanks a lot to all the panelists. And I would like to very quickly sum up the discussion for all the participants here. So definitely it has come out that biases and bridging the biases, bridging the gap is most important. It's important to increase the participation of women in the workforce. It's important to overcome the male dominance, and this can only happen when more and more women come in, they are employed in this sector, and they are participating in the development and the deployment stages. India has made progress as seen in the Stanford report. However, there is a push by the government, of course. However, a lot more needs to be done. And the more needs to be done both at the designing and the deployment stage, as Ayushi mentioned. And it's important that the AI continues to keep learning even after the deployment, because the technology it's all a learning phase. The technology needs to keep learning, keep improving. More importantly, stakeholder engagement and participation of women in the stakeholder engagement process is equally important, because the more we consult, the more participatory we make our policies, it's going to be more wholesome, more inclusive for all groups, all societies. So once again, thanks a lot, all of you. Thank you, Nidhi, for joining so late. And once again, thanks to all the participants. And we'll be sharing a brief note of whatever discussion took place here. And I think IGF would be sharing it with everyone. So thanks. And it was a pleasure hosting all of you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks all.